Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, the DPRK suspends all nuclear and missile tests, at least it promised, in the pledge to goodwill against all the other countries in a summit of leaders with the South Korean president. Could this be the first sign of serious denuclearization talks? And trade, technology, and trust were the focus of the IMF and World Bank spring meeting in Washington. They warned tariffs would slow down global economic growth. Could the warning help ease trade tensions between China and the U.S.? You're watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. We begin our show today on the Korean Peninsula, where efforts toward denuclearization bear some fruit. DPRK leader Kim Jong-un has announced that the suspension of nuclear testing, and he said that the country has set the goal of prioritizing socialist economic construction. So what does this historical announcement mean to the Korean Peninsula and the world? Before the discussion with a very strong panel, let's take a look at this.
Diplomatic efforts in the Korean Peninsula seem to be paying off. The DPRK announced last week it was ready to suspend its nuclear and missile tests.
The DPRK will stop nuclear tests and launches of intercontinental ballistic missiles from April 21, 2018. To guarantee suspension of nuclear tests in a transparent manner, the Republic's northern nuclear test site will be abolished.
DPRK leader Kim Jong-un said Pyongyang would never use nuclear weapons unless there is a nuclear threat or provocation, and will in no case proliferate nuclear weapons and nuclear technology. Kim also told party members that from now on, all of Pyongyang's efforts will be concentrated on building up a strong socialist economy. South Korea welcomed the decision and turned off the loudspeaker broadcasts into the DPRK. The Chinese Foreign Ministry also responded to the DPRK announcement today, saying it would bring much-needed stability to the Korean Peninsula.
China believes the DPRK's decision will help to further ease the tense situation on the Korean Peninsula, denuclearize the peninsula, and politically resolve the Korean Peninsula issue.
The surprise announcement comes just before Kim is set to meet South Korean President Moon Jae-in and possibly U.S. President Donald Trump. This Friday, Kim will go to the demilitarized zone that has divided the peninsula since the Korean War. He will be the first DPRK leader to do so since the fighting ended. The meeting between leaders of the DPRK and ROK could be the harbinger of long-term peace in the peninsula.
So what is going to be the prospect of the summit between the North and the South, and what are some of the latest news meaning for this future summit? Let's join our panel. We have in our Beijing studio, glad to have you here in Beijing, Robert Daly, director of the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States of Wilson Center. Welcome, sir.
Good to be here.
And also in Beijing, we have Zhao Tong, a fellow in the Carnegie's Nuclear Policy Program based at Carnegie Tsinghua Center of Global Policy. Welcome as well. In Medford, in the U.S., we have Sun-Young Lee, Kim Koo Korea Foundation Professor of Korean Studies at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. I want to welcome to this very strong panel. Let me begin with you, Mr. Lee. Professor Lee, what do you make of the upcoming summit? It seems that all sides do not necessarily depend on all levels of discussion anymore. They want to go directly to the summit.
Talking is good. It's certainly better than issuing threats of total destruction, nuclear annihilation, fire and fury. But the upcoming summit meetings are particularly good for the North Korean leader who seeks to be accepted as a responsible, normal, reasonable statesman, the steward of a responsible nuclear state. Notice how Kim Jong-un has not yet made any concessions. The mere utterance of abstinence from prohibited activities like nuclear tests and ICBM tests. That is no concession at all. We know those are banned, prohibited by more than 10 UN Security Council resolutions. But when it comes to North Korea, such statements they engender a lot of hope, and I would say unrealistic expectations of complete denuclearization.
All right. What about you, Mr. Daly, here in Beijing? From the U.S. side, do you think many of the things we have in mind, for example, denuclearization on Korean Peninsula, unrealistic?
Well, I would agree with Professor Lee that there's a lot of reason for skepticism, and I think that the expert policy community in Washington is skeptical, happy to be surprised on the upside. But there is little view that Kim Jong-un is actually prepared to give up his nuclear weapons. It isn't clear why he would do that. He has already gained a good deal of international prestige by sounding reasonable and making statements that sound like concessions. I would say that he has quite successfully, if not, he doesn't occupy the high ground exactly, but he comes to the summits on even ground internationally with the South Korean president and probably with the American president as well.
What about my question earlier, Mr. Daly, which is it seems that the earlier version of different levels of diplomatic talks among these countries. Earlier we had six-party talks and bilateral talks from different countries. But now this time it seems that state leaders, whether it's North or South Korea, or even the United States, giving the late May and early June possible summit, is going directly to the summit. Does it mean the old format didn't work? Does it mean the new format could provide hope?
No, they've flipped it. And I think there is some hope in the new format. This was forced to no small degree by President Trump himself and his sudden announcement that he was going to meet with Kim Jong-un. And I think that this also forced China's hand. It meant that all top leaders had to get involved. But even if the leaders go first, the mid-level professional diplomats and negotiators are going to have to come in afterward and still do all of the detailed work based on an agreement that is reached by the leaders. So we've tried it the old way before, where you build toward a summit. It hasn't worked. Let's now start with the summit and then see if the worker bees can come in and make sense of it. If it works, it works.
Well, let's start with the summit. What do you make of that version of the trying, at least? Mr. Zhao.
I think the two leaders, Trump and Kim, really understand one thing, which is their current bottom lines are far apart from each other. We talk about denuclearization. The North Korean definition of denuclearization is we would denuclearize if the security struggles are all resolved. If we trust you that you will no longer threaten me, if I trust that our long-standing historical hostilities are fully resolved in the long run. So that's like the Obama's nuclear-free world vision, it's long-term vision, probably not going to be achieved in one president's lifetime. But the American definition of denuclearization is we want to complete this process immediately. So it requires both parties to make major concessions in order to be able to make each other in the middle. And therefore, the only way to achieve that is to have the two national leaders to directly talk with each other. Otherwise, if they leave the negotiations to the operational level diplomats, the diplomats are always risk-averse. They would exclude these highly risky options from the negotiating table. So that's actually one thing the two presidents got it right.
Let's see whether they really get it right, because it is still being tested at this time. But Professor Lee, we understand the North and the South are going to have a rehearsal of this historic meeting, of this historic summit on the border between the two countries now on Wednesday. And meanwhile, South Korea has already stopped the propaganda broadcasting on the border toward the North. And after, that is, the North has made the earlier promise, as we have discussed. So, Professor Lee, it seems that efforts are being made at least to create a good atmosphere. Do you think conditions could be somewhat ripe in order to come up with a grand plan? Well, up to interpretation, of course. Professor Lee.
Well, if you look at the sequel, and I don't mean prequel, but sequel to earlier summit meeting in 2000, which was the first. In 2007, President Roh Moo-hyun visited Kim Jong-il in October 2007, and rhetorically at least made a lot of concessions, so we can expect a lot of bonhomie, pan-Korean ethnic nationalism and camaraderie celebrated, and those are all atmospherics. However, in real terms, in the 2000s, South Korea gave North Korea just unquestioned, about $900 million worth of aid, most of that in cash each year. And the United States also gave North Korea about $100 million a year between 1995 and 2008. So I think we can expect Kim to seek some financial rewards, not only the premature relaxation of sanctions enforcement against his regime, but some economic and political concessions as well. And as these talks go on, as they are drawn out, it will be very difficult not to give a little, to give some concessions, and that's what Kim seeks, time and money with which to perfect his own nuclear posture review.
Okay. Professor Lee is very well known for remember all the details of history, and that's what Professor Lee has fascinated me over the months and years we've talked. But one of the things is, Mr. Zhao, everybody, among the 6 parties, let's just say, has a playbook, as they see it, toward the other side. They always believe the other side would function in a certain way because history has shown. But the question is this time going to be a very different time, that the playbooks might be not anymore functional, or at least to a certain extent being further destroyed, if that could happen. Mr. Zhao, is there a possibility?
I think the parties have learned their historical lessons. Professor Lee mentioned about the previous engagement with North Korea, during which the U.S. and South Korea made major financial concessions in return for nothing from North Korea. And we also tried the grand bargain approach. We tried to reach comprehensive deals with North Korea for at least twice. In both cases, those deals failed. I think this time, people are starting to understand that approach probably won't work anymore. The comprehensive deal basically requires North Korea to trust the political commitment of the United States, to trust the security guarantees provided by the United States. But security guarantee is basically reversible. But North Korean denuclearization is irreversible. So it's very hard for that asymmetric agreement to sustain in the long run. So this time I think it's clear many parties are supporting an incremental process, a phased process in which we start with easy steps, maybe baby steps, but we start talking to each other, we start building connections, building better understandings, and hopefully that will pave the ground for more trust, for more radical steps in the future. Okay,
since you already said political, or rather security guarantee, I have to go to you, Mr. Daly. When is the United States going to really offer the security guarantee that the North Korea has been asking? If the U.S. promised, then it's really the ball is in the court of the North Koreans to see whether they really want to denuclearize or not.
Well, as you suggest, security guarantees are extremely easy to offer because they're very easy to reverse.
And that is not being done yet.
Well, but the United States has repeatedly made clear to North Korea that it had no intention to carry out regime change or to invade. So versions of security guarantees have been offered. As Professor Lee said, and as you suggested, some version of everything has been tried in the past. It's always failed. However, you have to try again, because otherwise, if you say it failed in the past is prelude, we can't do it, North Korea won't come through, then you can either accept North Korea as a full nuclear state or go to some version of a bloody nose strike. And so that does leave us with a phased, gradual approach, take a step and look around. However, the United States and this administration in particular are very suspicious of that, because they know through the past with six-party talks and other gradual processes, these become talk shops in which North Korea can buy time, develop technology, gain legitimacy, extract concessions, get more money, and at the end of the day, nothing has really happened. This is not a patient president on the American side.
Not a patient president, but what option do we have on the table? Do we have better options than the baby steps? If we do, let's go with the better options. We don't have other options. Therefore, how can all sides, in a way, at least cultivate a certain kind of possibility to make it work, given the fact that we don't trust each other?
Right.
But at least something possibly could be done. You talk about promises, but promises is different when it comes to the degree of security guarantee. What the North Korean is asking for is a armistice treaty and a peace treaty. And obviously that is not easily done. We all understand that, but there's no promise of possibility to explore it even from the U.S. side. So, Mr. Daly, I have to push you a little bit more about that because you're in a way coming from the U.S. among all of us. So will that be a possibility given the free spirit President Trump has apparently about some of the important international issues? Could that be a possibility?
Sure, of course it could be a possibility, but it would have to come after verifiable, meaningful concessions and moves toward denuclearization from North Korea. The armistice cannot come first. North Korea does not have enough credit, and it has posed too great a threat for too long to South Korea, to Japan, to the United States.
Okay, here put China and South Korea once again on some very difficult terms, because you see, that's in history, right, too, right, over the 20 years. North Korea and the United States, they all have their very strong stance, and therefore South Korea, China try to make sure that all sides could probably sit down and try to find a solution. But China, according to Chinese State Councilor, Foreign Minister Wang Yi, and here I would like to quote, because this later quote after his meeting with the Russian counterpart Lavrov, he said this: "We cannot let noise damage the continued improvements in the situation on the issue of Korean Peninsula." He also said, if we could play some of those wonderful footages over there, cannot allow those to interfere or obstruct the talk process among all parties. Obviously, the Chinese side is trying to make sure at least things could proceed from now on. Mr. Zhao, does China has that power and capability? Besides what Minister Wang said, what else can China do to make sure that could be the possibility?
Well, there is certainly a danger that some countries might divert the attention of the negotiation from nuclear issue to other political issues, such as the abductee issue that Japan really worries about and wants to put that issue as part of the entire negotiation. And based on the experience we had from the Iran nuclear deal, the most effective way to have a negotiated solution is to focus on a narrow issue area, so to focus on nuclear issue in this case. There are other things, which is some parties might have too high an expectation of the results. President Trump recently said, if North Korea is not going to make fundamental concessions, I might bail out of the meeting before it concludes. So it requires China to try to persuade every party to have realistic expectations before they go into the meetings. And also, it's important that China is experienced in nuclear power. So China can really contribute to technical level discussions. For example, this is a very important example because in recent conversations with North Korean officials, they emphasized their right to conduct peaceful satellite launch, which could be a potential barrier for future diplomacy, because the United States would see the so-called peaceful satellite launch as a disguised way to test their missile technology. But also, North Korean officials also expressed interest in conducting technical cooperation with other parties to make sure that they can distinguish the two programs, the civilian programs from the military programs, making sure the same engines will not be used in both programs, for example. So in this regard, China has the technical expertise to contribute and offer a technical solution on these important issues.
All right, technical expertise, that's an interesting way you term China's capabilities right now in terms of pushing forward the talks. As all of you mentioned, President Trump has recently voiced out a lot of tweets, and we could play some of them on our screen as we speak. So many of them that I cannot even catch up with them very efficiently. I hope I will in the future, particularly when there are positive messages coming over. But Professor Lee, I guess for South Korea, there's also an issue, because South Korea do not want itself to be so-called having an issue of Korea Pass, meaning all the other countries are deciding the fate of the Korean Peninsula without South Korea itself being an active and also decisive participant. Will this time the North-South Summit at least break that comma for South Korea, will so have a bigger voice no matter how the summit will proceed for the future?
In the short term, yes. And we know that Koreans, both in the north and the south, have a strong grievance against the big powers. Historically, Korea has been invaded several times by its neighbors, and there is a deep victim mentality and a yearning to take charge of Korea's own future. So an inter-Korean summit that changes the dynamic in the region is a good thing. Most Koreans are for that. And the South Korean president in the coming days and weeks will accentuate the positive, portraying Kim Jong-un as not a crazy dictator, but a reasonable, well-informed, and even self-effacing man who says reasonable things like he knows that the U.S. troops in the region, in Japan as well, play a stabilizing role. Therefore, he will not call for the immediate withdrawal of U.S. troops from the region. Kim will also say things like, well, everything I say about the U.S., American imperialists, that's for domestic consumption. I don't really mean it. I actually want to improve ties with the U.S. What is my basis for this prognostication? His father did it. His grandfather said these things to various officials, journalists, and intellectuals over the past decades. So South Korea will accentuate all that and get Trump to go into the meeting with Kim thinking that President Trump, by virtue of his own ingenuity and charisma and empathy, will be able to tame the North Korean dictator, and I think that will be a trap for Mr. Trump.
Oh, wow. Mr. Lee, of course, is very skeptical given the knowledge of history he has already had. But Mr. Lee, I need to follow up about the South Korea too, because President is actually putting his own credibility on the line. When he's, of course, having a big victory of having the summit, but at the same time, he possibly have to make sure some outcome will be a result of it, and therefore it could be reported to back to the American counterpart, and another summit could proceed from there. So, Professor Lee, it seems that the president is having a lot of his own credibility on the line.
Well, yes, and the president will always have his domestic critics, but at the same time, nation states, heads of state, like an individual, often blames others, and Mr. Trump is such an easy target of criticism and blame. His petulance, his rhetorical bellicosity, and all those will come back at some point, and it will be very easy to point the finger, lay the blame on the United States and not on North Korea's assiduous, very serious commitment to become a de facto nuclear weapons possessing state.
I see. On the other hand, China could also be in a difficult position. We mentioned about China's role as technical expertise in a way in the future talks and plans. But, you know, even today, Mr. Zhao, the deaths of Chinese tourists traveling in North Korea and the call from Chinese President Xi Jinping to make all efforts to save lives, and also China sent equipment, staff and drugs to North Korea in order to save more lives. But these could also all be issues and incidents related to China-North Korea relations for the future, Mr. Zhao.
Yes, I think Professor Lee mentioned trap of dealing with North Korea, but from the Chinese experience, I think there is also a great opportunity here. The United States imposed a travel ban on its citizens to North Korea, but China, as this story revealed, China continues to have exchanges with North Korea, people-to-people exchange, tourists in North Korea. Those channels of communications are very important because it provides an opportunity for outside world to understand North Korea, and also for North Koreans to be exposed to the outside world. Now, after achieving a basic nuclear deterrent and basic sense of security, North Korea is now pivoting to economic development. And China has a lot of experience to share.
Right.
In the recent meetings between President Trump and President Xi, reportedly, President Kim and President Xi, Kim reported that he wanted to learn from the Chinese government experience. So I think there's an opportunity, which is we can encourage and promote this interest in North Korea to gradually transform itself to become a normal member of the international community. That's where everyone can work together to promote.
Right. It's probably too early to see the end of the tunnel, the light over there, but at least you could see some possibilities, some light on the two sides of the same thing. Before we go, one sentence from every one of you. What shall we expect about the summit coming between the North and the South? Mr. Daly, one sentence if you can.
reported positive outcomes, trying to set up a good foundation for the Trump-Kim summit later.
I see. Professor Lee.
Euphoria, celebration, bonhomie, civility, and the mistaken notion that sing-song diplomacy, that is, South Korean pop singers who performed for Kim Jong-un on April 1st, paved the road for such a so-called breakthrough.
All right, not for propaganda broadcasting over the border. It's already quite an improvement, I would say. But last but not least, Mr. Zhao, final word.
I don't think it's realistic to have any concrete plan of dismantling North Korea's nuclear weapons, but I think two presidents would make a political communique to commit to the ultimate goal of denuclearization and to commit to continuing improving bilateral political relations.
I want to thank the three of you, gentlemen, for coming over to our show and help us to understand your own perspectives. It is very helpful on this very important critical juncture. Thank you so much, Robert Daly, Zhao Tong, and Sun Yong Lee. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much for being with us. And of course, World Inside with Tian, we will bring you all the updates on Friday when the summit takes place. And we're also going to have a very strong panel to discuss all the details. Stay with us here on World Insight. Still to come on our program today. The IMF and World Bank gather for a spring meeting in Washington, warning tariffs would put a damper on global economic growth. What the warning means for trade tensions between China and the U.S. right after this story. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. This program is going to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. The World Bank's spring meeting this year is wrapping up on Monday in Washington. There are three T's that dominated this year's meeting: trade, technology, and the other T is trust. Trade tensions between China and the U.S. were in the spotlight. Here's a quick look.
On a mission of growth, the International Monetary Fund forecasts a world economic growth of 3.9% in 2018 and 2019. It could be the fastest growth since 2011 if the forecast proved to be right. The fund says the engine of rapid expansion continues to be the Asia-Pacific region.
The economic outlook for Asia and Pacific remains strong, and the region continues to be the main growth engine of the global economy.
However, at the IMF World Bank meeting, concern over global trade is growing as China and the U.S. raise trade barriers. President Donald Trump last month approved steep tariffs on tens of billions of dollars of Chinese imports, while Beijing has slapped duties on key U.S. agricultural exports. Trade tensions between the U.S. and China do pose a big threat to confidence in the global economy and investment, though U.S. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin considers a trip to Beijing to hold talks on the dispute.
And it would not be something that would affect two countries, because the world is so interconnected. The supply chains are involving so many different countries, regional, intra-regional, inter-regional, that it would affect the global economy. So as Churchill used to say, it's better to chat-chat than to war-war.
The IMF says technological change is the biggest reason for the dislocation of people, which keeps them away from the benefits of global trade. Trust is another key word. At one panel of the annual meeting, China's Trust Index was mentioned. The 2018 Edelman Trust Barometer reveals that China rose to the top of the Trust Index, and China was also the market that had the most significant increases in trust across all key institutions. Currently, the world economy is facing a raft of challenges. China says it's ready to work on these challenges with the rise in trust indicators.
For a discussion on the IMF and World Bank spring annual meeting, we are joining in our Beijing studio Zhang Jianping, who is the Director General of the Center for Regional Cooperation at Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation. Joining us in London, Ian Begg, a professor at the European Institute and co-director of the Darren-Door Forum at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Joining us in Washington, D.C. in the U.S., Dan Slane, former Commissioner of U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission Commission. Welcome to the three of you. I want to begin with a quote coming from Ms. Lagarde, the IMF head. Christine Lagarde warns that U.S. and China trade frictions threaten confidence in the global economy. Take a look at this. In its World Economic Outlook released last Tuesday, the IMF cited 2016 research which shows tariffs or other trade barriers that lead to a 10% rise in import prices would lower global output by about 1.75% after 5 years and by close to 2% in even the long term. That's a big number if you think about the growth rate of many of the countries these days in the world. Mr. Slane, can China and the United States be responsible for not only themselves but also to seek a solution about the trade dispute right now? Is there a promising sign to you?
Yes, I think there is. You know, there's a lot of press hysteria over these tariffs, and really I think that Trump is using it as a bargaining chip to correct the trade imbalance that currently exists.
Is it really the press that is cooking the story, Mr. Zhang? I mean, President Trump himself saying once a time 50B, another time 100B. It seems that within these two numbers, there's only less than 1 week's time. So, well, if these numbers keep on being thrown from the White House, the other side, I don't know how China would take it.
Yeah, I'm afraid that most of people, both from China and the international society, fully, confused by those different sayings by Trump administration. So in this regard, I'm afraid that they released so lot of, different type of information. So today, I think that for Chinese side, of course, we will listen what kind of information they will release again. But meanwhile, I think the most important thing for us is to pay attention how to prepare, different type of solutions for different scenarios in the near future.
All right. Let me come back to you, Mr. Slane. Some of the latest news coming from Xinhua News Agency reports suggest Secretary Mnuchin is about to visit China, even though the date is not being confirmed, the exact agenda is not being confirmed. Do we see any promising sign that two sides could at least work on something like a plan for both of them? Meanwhile, the Chinese side, the Ministry of Commerce, did say it welcomed the talk, any kind of talk between the two countries. Mr. Slane.
Yes, it's always positive, but Trump is a different type of president than the three that preceded him. I think he is looking for action, and I think he's pushing hard, and I think he wants the Chinese to open up more of their markets and to have a more balanced trade relationship. So I see it as positive. I mean, I think that one of the problems under Obama and Bush and Clinton was the Chinese never felt that the United States was serious. I think they do now under Trump, and I think that there are going to be concessions, and eventually I think they'll work it out.
But of course, China has its own concern, just like the United States. There's also political issues, economic issues, trade issues that China needs to address. But Mr. Zhang, it seems that this kind of fight, verbal fight at least, and now to a certain extent already policy fight, would in a way distract people from the real issues the two countries need to handle themselves, which is structural reforms, China and the United States. Mr. Zhang.
Of course, I think that structural reform will be needed for both two sides. For example, for Chinese side, now we have so lot of manufacturing sectors to higher proportion in China's GDP. But meanwhile, China's service sector's contribution is less than the average level in a global economy, 60%, this type of level. China just 52% about. On the other hand, if you look at the U.S. side, on the contrary, in the past, in progress of globalization and the regional economic integration, so a lot of manufacturing sectors are moving out of the U.S. to international markets. But in the U.S., the jobless issues for those blue workers are very serious. That's why today Trump has a so extreme, attitude on this type of issues.
Yeah, I will let Mr. Beck to come in a bit later, but I have to come back to Mr. Slane. Here's the thing. It seems that the U.S., according to some, is trying to export its internal struggle of anger and impatience about its own structural reform to the relationship between China and the United States. Many wonder whether China has the capability, first of all, to handle that, to solve U.S. internal problem, and secondly, the sophistication for any country to solve the internal problem of another country. Mr. Slane.
Yeah, well, what's happened is, and Trump has taken advantage of it, is that many, many workers in the United States have been devastated by these trade agreements and by the mercantilist policies of the Chinese government. And yes, I think that by opening up more markets in China, by lowering tariffs such as automobile tariffs, etc., is going to create more work opportunities for Trump's base, and I think that's one of the things that he's trying to do. The globalists in the United States, the banks and the multinationals, they've done great, but most of the American people have not, and that's why Trump is in power today. And when the U.S. globalists understand that, then we're going to have some more reform, and otherwise it's just going to get a lot worse politically.
But Mr. Beck, you've been listening to your two colleagues talking to one another, certainly with a lot of reasoning, not shouting toward one another. But Mr. Beck, what about your take on this?
Well, the first thing to say is that although he does it in an extremely unorthodox way, you cannot deny that what Trump is trying to do and his administration is trying to do is entirely consistent with defending America's national interest. He perceives a problem of other countries exploiting trade agreements. He may be right, he may be wrong in some of that, but he's making headway on NAFTA, trying to renegotiate that, on asking the Chinese to be serious about trying to curb their resort to stealing intellectual property or having excessive trade surplus. So he is pushing agenda which, as was said previously, previous administrations have not done. Now that said, there is a bigger issue which you began with at the start of your program about what this does to the world trading system. And if it veers out of control, which is not impossible, then it's going to be damaging. We had this in the 1930s. What the World Bank and Christine Lagarde are trying to warn us against is this descending into a very negative kind of trade war rather than being a rebalancing, which is of the sort that Trump wants.
But sort of what Trump wants. The question is, what about the others of the international community? There are differences, but there are also different views about China among the countries. So what is likely to be the next step? Professor Beck, I want to ask for your opinion once again.
Well, I think these things have a tendency to calm down. There's a lot of what you might call saber rattling at the beginning. I demand this, you insist on that. And these sorts of things come out in the first public pronouncements. And then Steve Mnuchin's go to Beijing, things get rationalized a bit, you reach a compromise, a deal is made, and that's the way it tends to come out. Whether it's in everybody's interest remains to be seen, and there are going to be some losers, as there always are from any new kind of trade deal. And that's where you have this phenomenon of the users shouting loudest and the winners keeping quite quiet and saying, yes, we're happy to put this in our back pocket.
But can a deal be made? That is the question, isn't it, Mr. Zhang? We've seen a lot of shouting from the other side. Does it give China any space to make a possibility of real negotiations, of really looking at the real issues from both sides?
Yeah, my sense is that I hope that from the U.S. side, they should keep their promise on WTO. That is, since 1994, they will not use, 301, this type of old tools to blame other economies. This is the very important issues. Meanwhile, I hope that even if we have trade concerns and frictions, we can, we can explore potential solutions, on WTO rules and regulations. Also, that for China's own reform and reform and opening up, actually, China is still the biggest developing economy. We have our own procedures and progress. We hope that from the U.S. side, they also can, respect China's, own steps.
Right. But having said that, though, Mr. Zhang, you're taking the U.S. as if it is an iron board. Everybody agree with one another, but it's not. Mr. Slane, you know better than I do. Besides the division of labor among the governments, you also have a very unique president now. So despite of all these technical experts that are coming to China, or some of the important figures of the administration, will some of the discussions done, if it can be done, will provide any light of a future solution if the White House is having something very different in mind?
Yeah, well, I think that at the end of the day, it's all about negotiating, and Trump is using tariffs as a bargaining chip, and the Chinese government is very realistic and pragmatic. They are not going to allow a trade war to exist. So some negotiations will take place and some agreements, and both parties will give whatever is needed, and at the end of the day, it'll all work out. That's my personal belief.
Well, at the end of the day, we don't know how long is the end of the day before we are approaching there, but for now, I do appreciate that kind of sense of optimism coming from you as well, Mr. Slane. For now, I want to thank the three of you for being with us, Zhang Jianping, Ian Beck, and also Dan Slane. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.